Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Raj Jayadev from Silicon Valley Debug. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me on, David. Big supporter and fan of what y'all are doing at Vanguard.
Yeah, and I'm a big supporter of what you guys are doing at Debug. So I wanted to start by having you kind of share the story behind the founding of Silicon Valley Debug, and then describe how your mission has changed over the years.
Yeah, it's a pretty long and winding road, so I'll try to be succinct. But we start off very differently than maybe what a lot of people would perceive of what we're doing and what our mission is here today. When we started, it was a lot of ways more of I'd say a worker collective. It was back in the 2000 when Silicon Valley was just kind of pronouncing itself as the leader of the new economy, and there was a lot of mythology as to who was winning in that new economy and who was it for and who was it for the on the backs of. And so back then, um, a number of us were temping, and so back in those days, if you're a young person, an immigrant, or just needed some entry point into the formal economy, you would go to a temp agency and they place you really usually in the back end of some of these big tech firms that we hear about, like Apple or Microsoft, those kind of places. But you were doing physical labor, assembly work, warehouse work, the kind of aspects of the tech industry that most people at that time didn't really know about. There wasn't a thought as to, well, who is actually producing this new technology that is driving the new world? And on that side of the industry, it was non-union work. It was sublivable wages, no health insurance. And it was really kind of an invisible side of Silicon Valley. And for me, it really was a temporary gig. I'd finished college. I was unsure what I was going to do next, but I was temping at an assembly plant at Hewlett Packard making laserjet printers. Um, and Seeing that side of Silicon Valley and the conversations that were happening, we ended up organizing with other workers that had similar experiences. And the way we organized was by creating a local magazine. So we created a magazine that was a platform for people in Silicon Valley that were not maybe in the same dot-com trajectory as everyone who the thought was supposed to be in Silicon Valley. And so that became a kind of landing place for workers, for young people, for people that were formerly incarcerated, for people that were on the street, to come together to build community, to build a shared understanding of who our collective we was, and where we could go by our own terms. And so we call the magazine Debug because people speak a lot of different languages in Silicon Valley and San Jose and the neighboring cities. And we wanted to use the language of experience. And in those temp jobs that I talked about, like where I was at Hewlett Packard, if your product doesn't work right at the end of the conveyor belt, like everyone's kind of putting their own little piece on the conveyor belt and moves down. You call the debug unit to inspect the product and get to the root cause of the malfunction and expose it. And we thought that's what we want to do politically, socially, culturally. And so that was the start of the magazine. Um, and Debug kind of became like a kind of cultural touchstone, I think, locally in San Jose, where folks would come, they could chart out their own futures, they'd have a community that would support them. They'd have backup and support if they needed to take on a campaign or a struggle in some way. We kind of grew as a family. And then actually in February, so this is the 20 2026th year anniversary of the killing of Rudy Cardenas, who was a man that was a case of mistaken identity by law enforcement. and he was gunned down just blocks away from our community center at Debug. And so that was a pivotal moment for the city, for San Jose, but also for us as Debug, because we met Rudy's daughters. Some folks at Debug knew them already, and we went to the candlelight vigil where he was killed, and kind of intuitively said, look, whatever direction you want to go as a family to seek justice for your father, we're going to support you. And Rudy's case was emblematic, I think, of what happens everywhere. It was a case of racial profiling, of lethal violence that was unnecessary. And he was actually not even who they're trying to kill. So there's someone had missed their probation meeting, and law enforcement went to the guy's house to because he had missed a probation meeting, and they had a vague description, and Rudy drove by. They assumed that's who they're looking for. They chased him in unmarked cars, and they shot him in the back from something like 30 yards away. And so when we met the family, what they had was an impulse of who who they needed to fight for and how they needed to do it. We didn't necessarily they didn't have a roadmap necessarily, but we said, look, we're going to support you in your efforts. And so they led a local campaign, led to the first open grand jury in the history of Santa Clara County. The officer, Michael Walker, was indicted. He was not found guilty at trial. But meeting Rudy's family changed us forever as a debug community, where that fundamental principle of supporting families as they seek justice kind of recalibrated who and what we were doing, which led us to supporting families in court. Um, because what happened after we sort of were doing rallies and marches in San Jose for Rudy, other families that had lost loved ones to police violence also came to Debug and became the place where they would find solidarity with one another, and then we'd organize. And then people who were brutalized by police in other ways would come to Debug. And while we knew what to do sort of with the point of contact with police, like when someone was brutalized by an officer or racially profiled, when families would come to Debug and say, and I have court next week because they charged me with resisting arrest or what have you. Back then, we didn't necessarily know we could do anything. We thought the most we could do is maybe throw a car wash to raise bail money. And what we realized was we were letting people we loved and care about face the apparatus of the carceral system essentially alone. And we were cutting against our fundamental belief of collective action. And so back then, this was like, I don't know, 2006, 2007, around there, we decided to be irreverent to this idea that lawyers and judges are the only people that can have impact in the criminal court. And so we decided to penetrate the court system with community organizing, the same energy and IQ that we use out on the streets, and layer on top of a court system. And that's what eventually became what we call participatory defense now.
Perfect. Because I was just going to jump in anyway on the participatory defense question, which is, this is something you guys kind of pioneered. Where'd you guys come up with the idea?
Well, we didn't really have an idea. What we had was sort of an urgent need to act, and we didn't have a blueprint or any sort of manual we could go to. And all we really had was a fundamental knowledge of basic community organizing, this idea if we could collectively problem solve, maybe we'll be able to get further as a group than we are as an individual. And so those families that I told you would come to Debug, what we used to do was whenever someone would have a police violence case, we would say justice for Rudy or justice for Anthony, and then we would meet all centrally around that person and that family. So when there was a handful of families that didn't necessarily have a police case, but were facing a prosecution, we said, okay, for the eight or 10 people who had very like disparate types of cases. Like it might be a mom who had a youth that was facing the juvenile court, or it was someone that was facing a serious felony. That whole range, we just said, why don't we all come together on a Sunday afternoon and let's see how we could collectively move. And the difference was they would still be facing that really difficult, anxiety-filled road of facing prosecution and potential incarceration, but they'd be doing it alone. And if we could collectivize the experience through organizing, we might be able to change the outcome. And so those Sunday afternoons became kind of the backbone of what we now call participatory defense. Families whose loved ones were facing incarceration or were incarcerated pre-trial because they couldn't afford the bail money would come to the Sunday meeting, and we would basically ask two framing questions. People would be sitting in a circle, and they're seeing other people that are experiencing the same moments that they are in. So they find some kind of support and camaraderie on just in that, even emotionally. But then strategically, we would ask people to say the names of who they're there for. We'd write it on a list on a board. And we go through each name collectively with two framing questions. We'd ask for an update, which just means procedurally, where are we in the case? And as you can imagine, a lot of people don't necessarily know where they are because, like, as we say, oftentimes there's no my loved one got arrested school. So there's no reason for someone to know, what a preliminary exam is, or they have a bail motion coming up. They just know their loved one's incarcerated, and they're not even sure which questions even to ask in order to move forward. And so what we started doing was we started figuring out what some of those questions were, and also how to retrieve the answers to those. So a family would come in, and they'd come in because their loved one inside heard about it from someone else inside the jail and said, "Hey, mom, you should go to this spot downtown on Sunday afternoon." Or a family would be doing jail visits, and they get to know the other families that are visiting at the same time, and they'd say, "Hey, I go to the support group on Sunday afternoons. Why don't you come by? We could see how we could help each other." And so that family would come into the to Debug at a meeting. They're expecting a group of lawyers there that, there's going to, like, take a name and number, and a lawyer's going to take their case. And what they're seeing is other community members. And so they say the name of their loved one. They get asked kind of where we are in the case. And some of those locating questions might be like, well, when's the next court date? Do you know the purpose of the next court date? Who's the attorney? Do you know the charges? And then families would start, figuring out, okay, I need to email the public defender. I need to set a meeting with the public defender. I'm going to court on Wednesday. Can other families go with me? Is it possible to review the police report and point out the lies that the police were making up? Or can't, the lawyer says we're going into sentencing and we need to show why they should not have an aggravated sentence. Could we collect letters and photos that say why this person should be home in the community and has future prospects rather than facing decades in prison? And so there became tangible activities that the families could do on a weekly basis. And they would keep coming every week. And we would learn with each new case. Families, even after the case is resolved, would stay to help other families. And because we had this kind of discipline about the meetings and the circle growing, it ended up becoming a practice that had tremendous impact. Like, we saw cases get dismissed, that otherwise the person inside would have felt the pressure to plead because they didn't know the attorney. But now this time, when they call home and they talk to their family, the family says, we're meeting with the public defender, we have a game plan, and we're doing XYZ. They feel more empowered to take on the prosecutor and challenge the charges. So, prosecutorial theories break apart. They were maybe falsified to begin with. We saw felonies get reduced to misdemeanors. At sentencing, things that would have been prison commitments turn into rehabilitation programs on the outside instead. So it had transformative impact on the people that went to the meeting, the people that were inside looking for a community that would support them, but I had tangible impact on the case outcomes. And so we just kept going since then, and started sharing it with other communities across the country. And so after we trained groups, and when I say groups, it's like really anyone that was in the same position we were in. There were some, didn't have to be like an explicitly political organization. It could be a religion, it could be like a mosque or a church or anything like that. It could be a youth organization. They were just in the same position we were in, meaning they had people they cared about that would walk in their doors and say, "Hey, my loved one got arrested. What can we do?" And they knew they had some political power in their city. They didn't know how to flex it. So we would train them in what we were doing in San Jose, and then the impact was the same over there, whether it was in Nashville or Boston or New Orleans. And so that's how we knew that the practice had applicability in different contexts.
And this has been successful enough that some of the more aggressive public defenders' offices have actually reached out to you guys to come into their courtrooms.
Yeah, I mean, and I never would have anticipated that when we started. Like, as you probably know, David, like this notion of family and community organizing isn't necessarily something that's centered, I think, in law schools um, or even public defender offices initially. And so when we started, and families would be saying, instead of, "Hey, can I tap you on the shoulder in the court hallway and talk to you for 30 seconds?" The family would say, can we reserve a meeting? I want to go over ways that we could be helpful in the case, answer any questions you have. It was a different orientation. When public defenders had a client and they'd turn around and they'd see a courtroom packed of people versus empty pews, they sensed something was going on, but they weren't exactly sure how to connect or collaborate. And so there was some resistance initially, but then once they started seeing that the community and family support could help them achieve the goals that they had, which is the best outcome for the client, they would start reaching out. And so it really happens on an individual attorney level and also an office-wide level where um, if there's a participatory defense hub in that city or in that county, a public defender may reach out and say, I have a bail hearing next Wednesday. Sure would be really powerful if maybe you could connect with, I could send the family to your meeting. You could help create what we call a social bio packet, which is the name we use for those letters and photos that are collated, and pack the courtroom. And so they started using the community support, I think, in a tactical way, to try to win pretrial release or get a charge reduced or change an outcome at trial. And then office wide too, places like Philadelphia, like here in Santa Clara, they understood politically how to partner with participatory defense hubs in order to push larger policy aims, whether that's ensuring people where their criminal conviction might have more impact, worse impact in immigration court. Public defenders could then advocate for that level of freedom with support from the community, or if we have to go to the board of supervisors around trying to ensure that they have the adequate amount of funds in order to do like post-conviction relief work. Um, so it's really been a bridge. I'd say participatory offense has been a bridge for public defenders and the community in a way that otherwise was kind of riddled with distrust and distance.
Can you give us like an example of a big success that you guys had through the participatory defense? Because you know, I think it's a remarkable thing that you can organize at the community level and have this big an impact, and you guys have seen it firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of stories. I'll preface the example by just saying how we communicate the accomplishments to each other as a community. Where uh, when we started, in a lot of ways, our biggest obstacle is we had to convince community that they had agency to have impact, because the community as non-lawyers have been told so many times that it's not really their arena to make change. And so when a family would come to the meeting, there'd be some natural skepticism. And we would say, hey, look, if you do nothing, if you sit on your hands, the system is designed to give your loved one time served. That's the language the system used to quantify time of incarceration. But if you engage, if you partner with the public defender, if you advocate, you could turn time served into time saved. That's them home with you. And so we would it was a saying, like an organizing saying, but we would actually quantify the numbers. And so we would look, if someone was facing 10 years in prison and that family's coming to the meetings, they're working on the case, and maybe they get the case dismissed, we would say that was 10 years of time saved. When we started having all the hubs across the country, there are now, I think, 55 hubs in our national network, all count their years of time saved, and total it. It's a kind of an annual tradition that we have. This last year, when we total all the numbers from all the hubs, we had 38,806 years of time saved from incarceration. Um, and as you know, one day of incarceration could be devastating. So the amount of kind of life energy they're saving is incredible. But the example I shared, just because I just saw his daughter upstairs. I'm in the basement of Debug. But was Norelli's father. So Norelli's now a Debug organizer, participatory offense facilitator. But we first met her family at arraignment in Santa Clara County. And her family was at arraignment. This was, I think, 8 years ago now. Because her father was being accused of a very serious crime that had a life exposure sentence, and had a $2 million bail at arraignment. And we were going to arraignment every day, mainly to see how there's a new law change in California called the Humphrey ruling. We wanted to see how the Humphrey ruling was impacting cases. And we met the family, talked to the family, and the family reached out to the public defender and said, hey, do you think we could try to get a bail hearing to reduce the bail from $2 million, based on this new Humphrey decision, which said that people can't be detained or held simply because of their inability to pay. And they're fortunate to have a really aggressive and amazing public defender, Manuela, who said, yeah, let's go for it, which that alone was kind of, unheard of. I think the assumption was if it's a $2 million bail, you're cooked, like you're not getting out. And so the family made a social bio packet talking about his community connections, his work, even what his daily routine and schedule would be, where he's living, all these things. The public defender used Humphrey as a way to also advocate with the supplemented information from the family, packed bail hearing. He gets out on supervised own recognizance from a $2 million bail, and some nominal bail amount. So he's out. This was years ago. And that alone was so critical because because of the charge that he was facing, he was not going to take a plea for what he was accused of doing, which meant that he'd be going to trial. And in Santa Clara County, with that level of charge, he might not see trial for like 7 years. So he'd be detained the whole time, facing the pressure of just taking whatever the plea is. But instead, he was outside and he was working with his public defender and the family. The family went through all the discovery, made timelines that could counter the allegations of the alleged victim. They knew information about the family, of the other witnesses, the other people involved in the case. They gathered and organized that information to really disprove what the police were alleging about him. And what we did also too, as Debug, kind of like as a support of the family, is we showed how the allegations, which was based on something that happened in a very small apartment complex, um, and the allegation was that the alleged crime happened in the small apartment. The the reason why it wasn't talked about is because no one could hear it. And so we actually did a sound test. We got people that do music. I'm actually sitting right next to the studio. We do music at Debug, and so they did sound tests to prove that there's nothing that could have happened in a very small apartment that wouldn't have been heard. So that combined with the timelines that the family composed and created that disproved the allegation, the impossibility of it, was really the basis of what the attorney brought to the DA's office, and the DA's office dropped the charge. This was last year, so this was a life sentence, $2 million bail. No chance he's being even offered something that is agreeable to him. But because of the family and the community partnering with the public defender and a very aggressive champion in Manuela, the public defender, this grandfather is now home and comes in the meetings and supports other families because to him he is in a lot of ways a symbol, because he shows up at these meetings and these other families are about to start this really dark journey and they don't know if their loved one's ever coming home, but they see him and he shares his story and then they know that they could persevere as well and it's possible to reunify. So that's one example that is kind of front and center for me.
And I wanted to just talk to you a little bit. We're kind of running down on time here, but um, you know, talk about the role that storytelling plays in your work, because I feel like this is a really important aspect of everything, and not just for what you guys are doing, but for the criminal legal system in general.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling is, I think, kind of in our DNA at Debug. So consequently, it is part of participatory defense. And so, like for example, one of the most consistent activities families do in participatory defense is make social biography packets, which in a lot of ways is them taking control of the story of who their loved one is, so that their loved one isn't the story isn't told solely through the lens of a case file or a rap sheet, but from the perspective of those that are in that person's life and love them and are going to be part of their future. And so they're storytelling when they make a packet. And a lot of times they call it the book, like they made a book. That's what they for their loved one. Um, and it's a new way to articulate or give an alternative narrative who someone is besides a charge or an allegation. And then the other thing that we do in participatory defense is video versions of that storytelling. And we call them social biography videos, which are really the same thing as the letters and the photos, just in a video form. But we're interviewing people in their home, at their in their neighborhood, at the park, at the workplace, and they're telling this story that ends up being a 10-12 minute kind of mini documentary compilation of interviews, and that's being shown sometimes in open court, and sometimes just in chambers. But it's really a way to counter essentially what from our perspective is happening in courts, which is it's an exchange of stories. The prosecutor's telling the story, defense attorney is telling the story, and families through these different modules also get to be storytellers based on the totality of their truth.
You're kind
um,
of humanizing these folks.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's something that is central, I think, to what we're doing, because the families aren't trying to become, like pseudo lawyers or anything like that, but they want to describe their loved one and on their terms. And so storytelling is really the most effective and tangible way to do that.
And then finally, what are ways that people can get involved? And I know that part of the magic that you guys do is that you've been able to expand beyond just Silicon Valley. But how can people who want to make a difference get involved?
I think a couple ways. One is either there's a possibility that whatever county they're in, there's a participatory offense hub. So the first thing people could do is actually go to our participatory offense website, which is www.participatory.defense.org, and see if there's a hub in their vicinity, and if so, to reach out to that hub, because there's a couple things they could do. That hub may very well have some needs that people could support through volunteering or showing up. Like it might be a range, it might be helping families with social biography packets, it might be showing up to court, which is a common thing, or there may be some policy campaigns that participatory offense hub is working on based on the cases who come to the meeting. So for example, they right now in California, there's uh, hubs are working on a lot of trying to ensure resentencings that were kind of promised through some legislative changes are happening. That requires some political pushback on DAs and judges. The implementation of the Racial Justice Act, that requires not necessarily skilled litigators only, it requires a community presence. And so hubs may have specific needs based on their local issues that people could plug into that would be really helpful.
And then as we wrap up, I mean, you guys have basically been able to kind of reshape the nature of some of the system. Obviously, you haven't completely changed the system, but you've definitely made a difference in
Mm.
terms of these things. What lessons do you take away from that?
I think the main lesson is not to be confined by the roles that the institution says is agreeable, or acceptable, and to flex beyond that. And actually, the most effective change may be in being irreverent to the institution completely, and be willing and open to change, to change the ground underneath the courts. And that comes from an individual that has the courage and audacity to challenge, and a community that's willing to support them.
And you're able to do this, relatively on the cheap.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of I mean, it's basic fundamental organizing. As long as folks have a place to meet, there's certainly already a willingness and an urgency, and that's really all it takes. So a lot of hubs start as just families that wanted to come together, and they've become a force in their local jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people start getting involved because their family and friends get
Yeah,
involved, and all of a sudden they're like, whoa, wait, this isn't how I was taught the system is supposed to work. What can
right.
we do? And then people get frustrated. And so this
Yeah.
is an outlet for people that are frustrated, and it's a relatively low cost, low effort endeavor.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we give training. So folks are interested, just go to that website, and then we have a whole kind of process that we could walk people through on how to get started.
Well, thanks for coming on and sharing. I think what you guys are doing is amazing, and I think it's a great object lesson that we should all learn. That just because something seems intractable doesn't mean that it is.
It's well stated. Yeah. Thanks, David. Appreciate you.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.